especially nitrogen and phosphorus. Fewer organisms can live in hypoxic, low oxygenated water, and massive fish kills occur in many dead zone areas, especially in the Black Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. This affects society because the Gulf of Mexico is a major source for the seafood industry. These two pie charts show where the nitrogen and phosphorus mostly come from. In the nitrogen pie chart, 52% comes from corn and soybean crops, 14% comes from other crops, 5% comes from pasture and range, 9% comes from urban and population-related sources, 16% comes from atmospheric deposition, and 4% comes from natural land. And in phosphorus pie chart, 25% comes from corn and soybean, 18% comes from other crops, 37% comes from pasture and range, 12% comes from urban and population-related sources, and 8% comes from natural land. The Gulf of Mexico supplies 72% of U.S. harvested shrimp, 66% of harvested oysters, and 16% of commercial fish. However, since there were huge damage from developments of dead zones, the lack of fish affected the income of fishermen and the state economies. This graph shows that in the dead zone, no organisms can live, so fishermen have to go out further. As the milligrams of oxygen increase, there are more diversity of marine lives available for fishermen. So, in order for them to catch fish, they have to go farther, and that which causes an increase in the price for fuels and labor. Many have to grow fish on their own by fish farms due to the lack of fish in ocean, which also affects the economy and the society. This affects the economy as there is a less supply of fish with a constant demand for it. Not only does the quality of fish go down, but the amount of it does as well, making the fish much more expensive.
Many people realize that dead zones are a problem and want to change them. Since it has been discovered that the runoff of farming fertilizers and urban sewage waste are the primary factors in causing dead zones, many have worked to change agricultural methods and advance sewage treatment plants. Notice my demonstration of a farmer's fertilizer and urban sewage waste flowing into bodies of water and creating dead zones. The United Nations has helped by advocating other forms of fertilizer for farmers, such as recycled manure, which would decrease the runoff of nitrogen, phosphorus, and animal sewage into bodies of water. The United Nations also helped to adjust water treatment facilities and address urban wastewater pollution. Other suggestions for improving dead zones include using no more than the necessary amount of fertilizer for plants, initiating and refurbishing wetlands, and changing crop rotations and tilling procedures. Although there are still many dead zones present in oceans today, many have been reduced by adjusting nutrient and sewage runoff. Dead zones in the Black Sea, Hudson and East Rivers in New York, and Mersey and Thames Rivers in England all have been successfully reduced.
Today on Dead Zone Talk, our guest speaker is Kate Floyd.
Where are dead zones found and why?
Wow, good question, Kate. Well, dead zones are concentrated mainly around large coastal areas. This is because of all the agricultural runoff, sewage, and industrial emissions from lakes and other bodies of water that are released into the ocean and on the coast.
Is the amount of dead zones increasing?
Another good question. Dead zones drastically increased in the 1970s, causing a severe decrease in marine life. According to the scientists, the number of dead zones has doubled every 10 years since 1960. In the 1960s, there were only 49 dead zones in the world. This is attributed to the colossal conversion from forest and wetlands to agricultural and urban developments in the 1950s. This conversion resulted in the release of more nutrients and waste into the bodies of water.
Can you show me a graph?
Yes. This is a graph that shows the increase of millions of tons of fertilizers that is thrown out into the ocean every year. And this annual fertilizer use has climbed to 145 million tons. And this increase coincides with the number of dead zones around the globe.
How many are there now, and where are they located?
According to the United Nations Environmental Program report, 146 dead zones of various sizes exist around the world. Most of these dead zones are located in Europe and on the east coast of the U.S., primarily because these are the areas of water that receive the most nutrient runoff from the surrounding cities and farms. These dead zones can range from under a square mile up to 45,000 square miles. And some of the earliest recorded dead zones were in Chesapeake Bay, the Baltic Sea, Scandinavia's Strait, and the Black Sea and northern Adriatic Sea.
Can you show me an example of one?
I will. But first, let me show you. These are graphs of where all of the dead zones are. This specific one depicts the hypoxia areas around the world, and you can see they are mostly concentrated around these coastal areas where all the black dots are. Another graph would be this, where the marked labels are where all of the dead zones are occurring. And an example, as you asked, like a huge one where you can see a buildup right here is in the Gulf of Mexico. And that is one of the most reported dead zones in the world, and this is where the Mississippi River dumps the fertilizer runoffs. And yet, there are many other dead zones that are also significant, as I've shown here in this graph, such as South America, China, Japan, Southeast Australia, and New Zealand. This is a graph that depicts the number of total hypoxic sites globally and the years, and you can see past the year 1999, it just has skyrocketed, and there is a direct relationship between the two. Thank you for starring today on the show.
Dead zones are hypoxic areas in the world's oceans and lakes caused by human nutrient pollution along with other factors that deplete the oxygen required to support most marine life in the bottom and near bottoms of water. This process of receiving an excess of nutrients is called eutrophication. Eutrophication can cause decreased biodiversity, new species invasion, toxicity, and random increase in certain types of phytoplankton, which is known as an algal bloom. This is a picture that perfectly illustrates eutrophication. It starts off with the nitrogen and phosphorus making its way into the water. These nutrients can cause an increase in the number of phytoplankton in the water. The plankton turn into these algae blooms, which is the main problem of eutrophication. Then the algae dies off and starts to decay at the bottom of the waters. The decaying algae builds up and consumes a lot of oxygen. This is what is making the dead zones. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone is primarily caused by the excess nitrogen and phosphorus from the runoff of the Mississippi River, causing huge algae blooms. This is eutrophication occurring on a much larger scale. Since the bacteria are dying and consuming the oxygen in such large numbers, this eventually leads to extremely low levels of oxygen.
Hello, class. Today we'll be learning about how dead zones affect ecosystems. Dead zones elicit serious environmental degradation and disrupt ecological balance of subaqueous organisms in particular. Dead zones deprive water of oxygen, and in doing so, they decrease biodiversity as well as biomass. In order to better explain this, I have drawn a healthy ecosystem on this lovely whiteboard for you today. In this ecosystem, we see a great presence of oxygen, represented by O2 here. And the oxygen's presence in an ecosystem is absolutely vital because every organism needs oxygen in order to survive. Furthermore, in this ecosystem, we have plentiful life. We have underwater snakes, a starfish. We even have maybe a little guppy over here. We even have a seahorse. It's just like teeming with life. And also, within this life, in order to, every organism within this ecosystem is locked into this form of interdependence. And this is primarily because of the food chain, which is represented here. We have the shark, which eats a medium-sized fish, and then the medium-sized fish, which eats a smaller fish, and then the smaller fish, which feeds on plant life. And the plant life gains its nutrients from the soil. And this just really helps everything work together in this harmonious relationship of life and death. Now, in dead zones, oxygen is depleted. So there's little, if not any, oxygen left for the remaining fish. And because of this, the fish who have a low tolerance to oxygen void water are not able to survive. In turn, they are forced to flee the ecosystem, so they'll just disappear, or they'll suffocate and die. So, poor Mr. Seahorse over there, leaving this guy over here, and probably even the middle fish too. And this is really bad because every organism is locked into the system of interdependence. When other organisms are forced to leave, then bigger organisms that depended on their presence will have to leave as well, like the shark. So now we just have very sparing fish left. However, another important factor of this ecosystem is the small benthetic worms and the large benthetic worms. These worms work to kind of till the underground soil, and they are the organisms who are responsible for nitrogen mixing and in turn the nitrogen cycle. And if they were not to exist, the underwater plant life would not be able to gain its necessary nutrients. And because oxygen is so absent from this dead zone ecosystem, large benthetic worms, which are vitally important because they burrow deeper and mix up more of the soil, disappear or suffocate and die. So, see here, they're all getting erased. It's very sad. Goodbye, large benthetic worms. Therefore, the only remaining benthetic worms are the few small benthetic worms that were able to survive. However, they normally can only survive in the top soils because they're very small and they can only burrow so deep. This means that less nitrogen mixing is able to occur. And in turn, there's less nitrogen in the soil, and the plant life itself doesn't have the nutrients it needs in order to survive, so it dies too. And when these die, it's very, very bad because all of the other organisms that, even though they have a higher tolerance to oxygen void water, are forced to flee or die as well. As their name insinuates, dead zones are areas void of life. Ultimately, this is due to their ability to reverse nature's inherent balance. They dismantle the food chain by breaking down its individual links, as demonstrated by the loss of the benthetic worms and the small, low-tolerant fish. And with a broken food chain, the food web is entirely compromised. Since every organism is locked into a system of interdependence, a breach in one part of the ecosystem creates a domino effect of migration or death for every other organism within this system. In essence, the poisons of dead zones penetrate throughout the entire ecosystem until every organism in the ecosystem is dead or has fled the scene. Thank you.